Thank you so much for that introduction. As most of you probably know, I do not have the skills of Utrice Lee. I am not a very good discussion leader. And I have a tendency to write what I say. That does not mean that I am incapable of speaking without notes and the manuscript, but I prefer to read my speeches. In that way, it becomes absolutely impossible for persons with less than honorable motives to misquote. I have entitled this statement, "The Crisis of the Negro Leader." While Utrice's presentation was of an extremely and very helpful practical nature, this statement will be more theoretical. But in stating the theory, I think that we might gain some insights into the nature and method of effective leadership of an oppressed people. A few days ago, I received a call from an old and dear friend, Grace Killens, the widow of the great African novelist John Oliver Killens. She was calling me regarding the disposition of the Killens papers. It seems that she is being courted by a number of major white universities, which are offering a substantial amount of money for the privilege of including the papers and works of Killens in their collections of great literature. Although she did not mention it during our conversation, the irony of the matter could not have escaped her attention. Neither the collection or a single Negro university or college, nor the HNIC at any white university or college has seen fit to make an offer for the Killens collection, nor in the event of insufficient funds to afford the collection, made any attempt to approach their masters for the necessary funds. As we talked, the conversation shifted from the particularity of the Killens collection to the generality of the current state of the race in America. She solicited my views on the rationale for the suspension of Alton Maddox from the practice of law, and an update on the status of his reinstatement, and concluded the conversation seeking my advice with respect to the appropriate manner for her to aid in the facilitation of Alton's transition to the private practice of his profession. Invariably, as is the case with every conversation I have had of late with reasonably conscious persons of African descent, the discussion shifted then to the question of the state of black leadership in a steadily deteriorating black political, social, and economic environment. Most of the people whose opinions I respect seem to have concluded that the African situation in America in the 21st century will be far worse than it has been in the 20th century. The day after my conversation with Grace Killens, I received a call from Alton Maddox, who asked me what I would like to talk about at the 1999 convention of the United African Movement. My reply was that I would talk about anything he might suggest. He suggested that I say something about black leadership. As most of you are aware, for many years now, I have found nothing good to say about the quality of leadership in black America. I have rather cited instance after instance of the failure of traditional black leadership to fashion rational solutions to the predicament of race in a racist society. More recently, I have softened my critique, which for years attributed a deliberate and malicious intent to the black leadership class, upon a more sober and focused reflection. The emphasis of my critique has shifted from that of a failure of leadership to that of a failure of intellect on the part of the alleged leaders of the race, and have suggested that a fundamental deficiency in the use of language is largely responsible for the failure of intellect, and that the failure of intellect has led inexorably and inevitably to the demonstrated failures of black leadership. In other words, I have come to the conclusion that one does not rationally criticize the intellectually impaired for an inability to think critically. I should like to take this opportunity to elaborate the bases of my revised hypothesis and to suggest, if I may, an intellectually respectable way of assessing black leadership, and in the process, a rational way in which future leaders should be chosen and leadership exercised in a racist society by authentic leaders of an oppressed people. Let us begin our analysis with the identification of the current classes of recognized black leadership in America. In this connection, I am intentionally eliminating a consideration of committed and in many cases highly effective local grassroots leaders whose names are not nationally recognized by the masses of our people. At the national level, black leadership falls into three categories, and the individual leaders sometimes find themselves in more than one of such categories. The categories are as follows: religious leadership, civic leadership, and intellectual leadership. In an earlier era of our history, I would have included the organized black bar as a fourth category. Unfortunately, that category is no longer relevant to a discussion of black leadership in America. After attending the annual convention of the National Bar Association in July, and having observed the combination of a rock concert, the conferring of white corporate gifts, and a keynote address incongruously crowded into the same program, I said to myself, as I was leaving in the midst of the begging frenzy and before the rock concert, that the evening's activities constituted a perfect metaphor for the state of the race in 1999. A finger-popping, begging elite, giving lip service only to the suffering of a racial minority in an aggressively racist society. So much for leadership from the black bar. Religious leadership. Black religious leadership, whether of the Christian or Muslim variety, is theologically incapable of providing a viable path out of our current situation. Once a week, whether on Friday or Sunday, millions of the faithful gather at their respective churches or mosques, where in most instances they are taught to endure with patience the iniquities of an unjust society, and at the end of the sermon are comforted in the faith and belief that soon they will be done with the troubles of the world, and that they are going home to be with God. The theological bases of the two major religions of the African in America are inconsistent with an effective liberation strategy. Christian and Islamic eschatology both lead inexorably toward a posture of individualism and quietism. Unquestioning faith in an omnipotent and benevolent God who will right all wrongs in the great hereafter is inconsistent with Islamic tolerance of slavery and Christian pietistic quietism, but utterly inconsistent with a sustained and dedicated struggle for the liberation of an oppressed people on the planet Earth. Even the proponents of a black theology of liberation have failed to reconcile the contradictions inherent in Christianity and black liberation. As my cousin William R. Jones has painstakingly demonstrated in his book, Is God a White Racist?, their theodicies are packed with inconsistencies and contradictions. Martin Luther King Jr. taught us to turn the other cheek in the face of racist atrocities. In doing so, he was operating well within the parameters of sound Christian doctrine. He was operating at the same time well outside the parameters of a meaningful liberation theology. The Christian doctrine of love and forgiveness of one's oppressors is totally at odds with the notion of black liberation. It is the implicit and explicit acceptance of and adherence to these Christian principles and the submission to the will of Allah in the face of extreme prejudice, discrimination, oppression, and genocide, which have rendered ineffective a religion-based movement toward black liberation. These pervasive belief systems among the black population have served the oppressor well, as our masses become increasingly individualistic and quiescent in their responses to the acceleration and intensification of aggressive oppression in an increasingly fascist state. In the context of a struggle for African liberation in a racist society, the only relevant Christian is the Christian who adopts the principles and practices of Jesus, the iconoclastic revolutionary, who healed the sick, who fed the hungry, who counseled the rich man to sell all his possessions and give the money to the poor, and who threw the money changers out of the temple. The relevant Christian rejects any aspect of the religion which might be interpreted as preventing an oppressed people from defending itself against a racist oppressor as a precondition of personal salvation in the hereafter. A just God cannot require so obscene a contradiction. Civic leadership. Black America is replete with bourgeois civic and civil rights groups, each of which, to a greater or lesser extent, gives lip service and in some cases money to the alleviation of the plight of the black masses. 100 Black Men, the Lynx, Jack and Jill, the Guardians, the Comas Club, the National Negro Golfers Association, the Boulé, the National Conference of Negro Women, the National Medical Association, the National Dental Association, the National Bar Association, the Greek letter organizations, including Alpha Kappa Alpha, and a host of other professional and business associations and organizations hold their annual conventions and in most cases provide scholarship assistance to deserving young Negroes who they hope will grow up to be good American citizens like themselves. That is to say, Negroes who are well adjusted to the oppression of a racist society and who find a way to coexist amicably with their oppressors. Most of these Negroes are associated with a church or a mosque and implicitly accept the counter-revolutionary doctrines of traditional Christianity or Islam. Within the category of civic leadership, one must include the traditional civil rights organizations such as the NAACP, Urban League, SCLC, and Operation Push. Unlike the aforementioned organizations, these groups were ostensibly created for the express purpose of pressing and defending the human rights of the oppressed black masses. And true to the tenets of traditional Christianity, each of them preaches either implicitly or explicitly a doctrine of quietism in the face of overt racist oppression. They conduct a protracted and militant struggle on behalf of the black masses in pursuit of corporate and government handouts, the proceeds of which are used primarily to promote the employment, businesses, and housing needs of their petit bourgeois constituencies. Their activities insofar as they remove the focus of societal attention away from the suffering of the masses are counter-revolutionary and inconsistent with an intelligent struggle for the liberation of an oppressed people. The psychological paradigm out of which such activities emerge is the same paradigm which informed the behavior of our slave ancestors. Only the clothing, the housing, and modes of transportation and communication have changed. The mindset and behavior patterns are unchanged. Intellectual leadership. I shall not spend much time on the question of intellectual leadership. The best known members of the intellectual elite among the race, with a few notable exceptions, are to be found on the extreme right wing of the political and economic spectrum. These are the Negro neo-Darwinists who would put the welfare mother into the streets as a street sweeper without food stamps or health care, rather than provide her with the educational tools and government stipends required to pull her and her family definitively out of poverty. In the event of an all-out struggle against racist oppression in America, These right-wing Negroes would be tried as traitors by a people's court and hauled before a hastily assembled firing squad. For purposes of this discussion, it is the other group of well-known Negro intellectuals who purport to speak for the black masses, which is of interest for purposes of this discussion. They are to be found at the Ivy League universities and on television talk shows where they intellectualize and philosophize concerning the plight of the black masses. Yet here again, their ruminations concern only the anatomy of oppression in a racist society. At no point does any of them, with a few rare, heroic, and much maligned exceptions, have anything to say of relevance to a true struggle for the liberation of the race. In almost every case, there is no analysis of the fundamental principles upon which the system of exploitative and racist capitalism rests. At no point do they raise, within a tightly reasoned economic context, the issue of back pay for 250 years of forced labor. At no point do they raise the question of the rape of the human resources of Africa and the necessity of African reparations for the rape and plunder of that continent. They, like their civic and religious brethren, while deploring the pitiable plight of the black masses, are silent on a strategy designed to liberate the masses from their plight. They delight in proposing protracted national conversations on race and lend their names and reputations to such conversations. The most recent Commission and White House Conference on Race, established and convened primarily to bolster the popularity of the president among the black masses, ended with the prostitution of the reputation of John Hope Franklin, a Negro intellectual who, until he lent his name to that obscene exercise in racial containment, was thought by this speaker to be too old and too wise for a twilight ego trip. The majority of Negro intellectuals are committed, like the theological and civic leaders, to a theology and or philosophy grounded in individual salvation, whether of the secular or religious variety. As such, they have no rational message for the masses of the oppressed. What is the common factor in the failing of these three groups of Negroes to alleviate the oppression of the masses of Africans in America? I would suggest to you that the common factor and flaw in the philosophies and activities of each of these groups, excluding the neo-Darwinists who reject even survival, not to mention liberation, as a strategy, is the failure or refusal to understand the fundamental difference between racial survival and racial liberation. If we should examine closely the intellectual underpinnings of the ideas and programs of each of these categories of leadership, we would quickly discover that nowhere in their thinking is there a strategy for the liberation of an oppressed people. On the contrary, their strategies are predicated solely on a philosophy of individual survival in a racist nation. For almost 400 years, the strategy of survival has been successfully implemented by our Negro leaders. It is the strategy which sustained our lives in the dark days of slavery. Upon closer examination, it will be observed that the essential outlines of that strategy have not changed since the days of slavery. Each of these groups is betting on the will of the oppressor's government to liberate them from bondage and oppression. Each of them depends on the largesse of the oppressor's businesses and corporations to finance their survival in an oppressive and racist society. Each of them is thoroughly convinced that without God and Whitey, they can do nothing. This, I would suggest to you, is not the language of a people who would be free. This is the language of a dependent and inferior people who are afraid to face the responsibilities of liberation. Because they fear the responsibilities of freedom, they are unprepared to fight for their liberation from oppression. Because they are unprepared to fight for their freedom, their young men and young women are gunned down like dogs in the streets of our cities, hauled off to prison by the hundreds of thousands, and when lucky enough to escape the roadblocks and other traps set for them by racist gendarmerie, they are humiliated on a daily basis by white racist bureaucrats. And in case those who have escaped the common fate rise up in anger and frustration at the unacceptable levels of oppression, our Negro leaders are always on call to rush in and calm the masses with their marches and messages of nonviolence, love, atonement, and reconciliation. Meanwhile, genocide proceeds apace as our leaders sip their cocktails in the tents of their enemies, who are only too happy to fund their survival strategies. Our annual conventions and commemorations are nothing more than celebrations of our survival, where we are joined by our oppressors, who celebrate along with us, but who understand that our definition of survival is exactly the same as their definition of containment. It would be interesting to count the number of our white supporters who would show up to celebrate the formation of a serious black organization dedicated to the liberation of our people from racist oppression. It is for the foregoing reasons that I have declared the Negro leadership intellectually bankrupt and functionally illiterate. They must be replaced by a literate, independent, mass-oriented, militant, unafraid to strike a blow for freedom leadership, which understands the difference between racial survival, which was taught to us by the slaves and the slave masters, and black liberation, which cannot be taught to us by the current Negro slave class, whom we have mistakenly categorized as our leaders. In the months leading up to the third millennium, it is my hope and plan that a strategy of Negro leader replacement will be fashioned and honed to the point where some of us will enter the 21st century as free men and women, secure in our being and capable of shouldering the responsibilities and burdens implicit in the concept of liberation. To do less than that is to accept the limitations of slavery and life on this planet as a race of world-class beggars. It seems to me that we can do better than that. Thank you. I don't have any graph things put on the board, but I will take some questions, and then when we finish this aspect of it, I'm going to run through another piece that I did called The New African. I'm not talking about my magazine, I'm just talking about this piece I wrote. There's a chapter in Coming of Age in the Third Millennium. I'll probably delete some portions of it, but it also gives you some notion of my concept of what constitutes not only the new African, but the kind of African that is qualified to lead the race in the third millennium. As you know, the name of the book is Coming of Age in the Third Millennium. And one of the chapters in that book is called The New African. And I think it might shed some light on, or at least further elaborate my view of the kind of people that we ought to be looking to in the third millennium for leadership of the race. But I'd be glad to take whatever questions you might have with respect to what you've just heard.
Well, I think I would say I agree with you. Well, can we go above 100%, whatever percentage we can reach? I certainly agree with you. What is your strategy for developing this next phase of your plan, and who or what? Well, I guess we can understand what kind of people would be involved, but are you beginning to think of who would sit in, such as a think tank, to develop this plan?
For the past 20 years, I have spent a good deal of my time trying to identify the best serious black minds in America. And when I say serious, I mean those who have an understanding of language and who know the difference between black survival and black liberation. Jim Bell sitting there is one of those people. And I've discovered in recent years, traveling about the country and the world, that there are literally hundreds of Jim Bells out there, people who are committed to the struggle, who understand the uses and misuses of language, who have been made invisible by a racist society. Many of them are to be found at universities where they get no exposure whatsoever. They're just teaching. There are other businessmen, for example, who are doing very well, but who have a clear understanding of the nature of oppression and who understand the importance of dual citizenship for black people in African countries. And I think that is especially important right now. If Y2K is going to be half as bad as they say it is, we might want to take a look on the other side. And it is my notion that it is time to bring the best and the brightest of these people together, including your chairman, Alton H. Maddox, to some location that will remain secret, obviously. And we will have a sit down with people who mutually trust each other, and to establish what will be not only a think tank but an action tank. Because as Kwame Nkrumah informed us, the complete revolutionary is a man of action who thinks and a man of thought who acts. That's the kind of person we're looking for. We're looking for people who have accomplished something in their lives, who have a complete understanding of racist oppression, who have a love for their race, and who have the capacity to do something about it. And I might say that anybody in that group, if he is not prepared to die for the accomplishment of the liberation of his people by any means necessary, he will not be sitting at the table. One of the problems that we have is that despite our having aped the white man for 400 years, the one thing that we do not seem to have understood is that most of the gains achieved by white supremacy over these last 400 years have been gains which were obtained through violence and bloodshed. And we are the only people in the world who refuse at this point in our history to defend ourselves from violence that has been perpetrated against us. If the B'nai B'rith can form the Jewish Defense League, why cannot we form some kind of physical defense against the atrocities that are being perpetrated against our people on a daily basis? I would suggest to you that police brutality would not be a problem in this country if every now and then a perpetrator of police brutality was taken out. Back in the civil rights days, at least we had the deacons for defense and justice. Where are they today? There's nobody offering physical resistance to racist atrocities. They're taking out our young people, they're taking out our women. It has gotten to the point where they apparently believe we will take anything and say absolutely nothing. Not only will we not defend ourselves, but we don't even give lip service to it. Now you got the Urban League all of a sudden taking the lead in the fight against police brutality. It's unbelievable. How can an organization like the Urban League, whose president spent half of his keynote address praising Shell Oil, one of the most racist corporations in the world, how can we expect this man to take a strong position against police atrocities against black people? But that's what we've come down to. And nobody is saying anything. Well, don't get me started on Jesse. But that's essentially the way we intend to do it. I would hope that out of this meeting will come some very strong position papers in which an analysis is made of the current status of black leadership, which will expose the current leaders as sellouts, con artists, rip-offs, and whatever else you might think of. Because somebody has got to make it clear to the masses of people that you don't just follow these people because the white media has thrown them out there. This has to be a very serious analysis of where the race is at the moment. And we do not have a lot of time. The concentration camps are already operating. All they have to do is open the gates now, and the first sign of trouble, if there is a breakdown of law and order, electrical systems, or what have you, as a result of the computer bug, you may be certain that the mechanisms are in place to quarantine the black community and to march us into those camps. And we only have about 5 months before we find out what's going to happen. We need to have some alternatives to life in a concentration camp in this racist society.
Would this include Africans outside of America, and would this include the women as well?
You mean in the conversation that in this meeting? Oh, absolutely. Yes, it will be an international confab, but it will be very quiet until we're ready to make a position. Yeah. When I'm not. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. No. Pardon? Yeah. Yeah.
It's not really a question, but first I just want to thank UAM for giving me the opportunity to continue to grow. Clayton Jones, you probably don't remember me. 30 years ago, you have saved me in my life. It seemed like all my life I had been like used, struggle. I was in the process of setting up a corporation, and I came into a lot of these Negroes that you're talking about. I will not call names because it's not important. But I lost a lot of money, and I was at one of the lectures that you had, and I'll say right now, you are still as gracious then. I get more information in 1 hour when I get back to New York than I do in a whole month in Virginia. Information is not there, and they're leading us to the slaughter. Right up the hill, they are training these young white rebels to fight us. And my sister and my daughter who work in the prison system don't want to arm. I said, we can go out in the woods secretly and train your young boys how to shoot. But anyway, I didn't mean to go off into a tangent. I just wanted to thank you again.
I might say that you look pretty much now like you looked then. You haven't aged at all.
Clayton, one of the things that I think, are there any blacks who are studying the European, the white man in the same way that white people study us? Every facet, everything about us, they study us and they understand our weaknesses, etc. If they are, what are some of their weaknesses? I think that's why a lot of people don't want to go up against them, because they feel that there's no win.
Omnipotent?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of, I mean, if you come up and go through a white university system, you know the same thing they know. The question is, do you use what you know? There are, well, let me just give you an example. Show you just how vulnerable these people are. I had a meeting the other day with a young man in his early 30s. He's a genius. He is an indispensable person in an organization which controls the platforms for all of the companies that do business on the internet. He's the only man in that company that understands every aspect of the way the system works.
Black.
He is black. He's about 30 years old, totally committed to the reconstruction of Africa. And he is not obviously yet at the point where he is prepared to just, push a button and destroy all of e-commerce. But he could be brought to that point. And there are other black people similarly situated all around this country. And it's just a question of their perceiving a shift in the way white people treat black people in this country, which would push them to the point where they could sabotage the whole infrastructure of the information age. They're out there. They're out there. And thanks to Jim Bell, I have met many of them. And all of them around 30 or 25, totally committed to Africa and African development.
I think that's one of the reasons more blacks don't run to the gate. They think they can't get voted.
Right. That's true.
That's good.
Yeah. And another thing, and I want you to think about this very carefully. You know, Ghana is now given dual citizenship. Just kind of watch things, see how they develop over the next few months. And if it gets a little hairy and the weather starts to act kind of funny, then you might want to think about a trip and just celebrate the new year on the continent. You might want to think about celebrating the new year in Africa, because they're not confused with the computer chips the way we are over here. See, if it goes out on this side, we're finished. We're finished. No electricity, no water. You know, they will close off the black neighborhoods of this country so quickly we won't know what hit us. Mobs in the streets, white people arming all over the country, SCLC collecting all the black arms that are out there and paying people $50 a whop. You understand? I mean, we're being set up just in case. I'm saying if it is at all possible, let's try to spend the new year on the continent of Africa. And we will not be bothered by Y2K, I can guarantee you that. Not in Africa. I mean, there might be some minor disruptions, but there aren't that many computer chips operating on the continent. And the other thing is that you can live off the land. You know, you can always go into the bush and find yourself a papaya about that big, you know, that's breakfast. And then some bananas, you know. I lived in West Africa, and I can tell you that you can live off the land. Yeah, I had my breakfast from my backyard every morning. I'd send my man out, and he'd climb up the tree, and he'd get a coconut and a bunch of bananas and a papaya, come in and cut it up and whatnot, and I'd have a fruit breakfast every morning, fresh fruit from my yard. That's how you live in Africa. This thing over here, this is not where it's at. I'm telling you, yeah, you can live very, very nicely over there, and you don't have to look over your shoulder every 15 minutes to find out whether some racist is trying to do you in. So that's something you might want to think about. I'm not saying that you must do it. I'm simply saying think about it. Even if you come back after it's all blown over, at least be there when the crunch comes, because the crunch is going to come. And if it comes at all, that's when it'll do. Martial law and everything else will be declared as soon as there's the slightest hint of a disruption.
I'm not sure, but I thought that there were some black think tanks around. And if so, what do you think of them?
Well, there's one called the Lincoln Foundation, which is the one to which I was referring initially, that has all these neo-Darwinists, you know, those who believe in survival of the fittest and do nothing to help the poor and the disadvantaged. That's the major black think tank around. I'm sure that there are a few others of more liberal persuasion, but you don't hear anything from them. There used to be an organization down in Atlanta called Institute of the Black World, which was kind of a think tank, and they were putting out good stuff, but they couldn't get funded. So they went out of business. That was Vincent Harding and Bill Strickland and the fellow who's now the head of the Schomburg, what's his name? Yeah, he was down there. They were putting out some good work. But all of that's gone now. You don't hear of anything.
You said they don't get funding, you mean they were expecting government?
No, they were expecting some black people to fund them. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to say, if you say you have an organization or something that you looking out to do, if you have, what I'm saying, I use UMAM, I go to other organizations, we must put gather a group of people will agree on principles under this umbrella and take it off of the white races in this country and let us, since we have a small group, go, I find I take care of this building. I didn't go for no job. I've been in Black Revolution so many years, and a lot of people think
You got other forces, the lead of Castro, like Civil War, something like that.
What other groups do you have in mind? Well, I'm just saying, you say other people. Which specific groups would you have in mind? The Asians? Are you talking about the Asians? The Mexicans? Who are we talking about? Yeah. Yeah. Let me suggest something to you. Until we take concrete action to liberate ourselves, there will be no coalitions. Coalitions are formed among equals. And right now we are unequal to everybody. Well, that's what this whole speech was about. We still have the mentality that got us through slavery alive. Our posture in America today is essentially the same as it was during slavery. It's individual survival. And there are very few of us who are prepared to rock any boat which will jeopardize that fundamental need to survive. We've never got past that. Liberation is something, as I said, that requires responsibility. And we are not a responsible people. Most black people do not believe that they can operate without white support. Let me give you an example. In Atlanta, Georgia, which probably has the largest percentage of black millionaires in the country, okay? The Negroes down there got so much money, it's ridiculous. I mean, just one suburb after another with these $2-3 million houses. And then there's a whole black corporate elite down there, 100 black men. I was talking to a few of them the other day, and they were debating with each other as to which of them was most successful in their eleemosynary activities with respect to their annual banquet where they give the prizes and the awards to the young children in the school system and whatnot. And the standard of success was how many white sponsors they were able to bring to the table. That was the measure of success. Not how much money I gave to 100 black men, but how many white sponsors I was able to find. Now, at a more fundamental level, I'm going to tell you a little story about something I saw on television. you know, being retired, I'd sometimes turn on television. I can see, you know, a lot of little silly things that come on. And they had this thing, it was called, it's an old program, Candid Camera. And it was a bookstore scene. Some of you might have seen it, maybe not. Yeah, they had about, there was a man there who was selling these books. And several white people came up, and when they gave the book to him, he would open it up, and he had a pair of scissors. And he started cutting out sections of the book. And he explained to them, you know, there's a lot of stuff in here that you shouldn't read. You know, we got to be careful about what we read nowadays. He just clipping. And all the white people said, hey, wait a minute, hold it. I will make that decision for myself. Now, you take that book, you put it in the trash can, because I'm going to get another one. I've already paid for it, so I don't even want to talk about it. I mean, they got disgusted. Here comes the black lady. He starts clipping. You know, we've got some terrible things in these books, and you don't need them. You're absolutely right. Just cut it all out. That is the master-slave mentality. She was letting this white man decide for her what she should read. And this was not a welfare mother. I mean, this was a middle-class black woman who permitted this white man to make a fool out of her on national television. And that is the slave mindset. And I don't care how you dress it up. I don't care how many Lexuses you might drive, as long as you believe that the word of the white man is superior to yours by definition, you're in slavery. And that's the problem that we have, and that's why I'm saying that any leadership that we have that does not yet understand that we are not inferior to white people is a dangerous leadership.
into following the people. So it seems to me it would be incumbent upon us to know, to try to take glaring examples of things, make it crystal clear to the people, and let them set the fire under the leaders to force them to be there to handle the issues. I mean, like for instance, when we're talking about police brutality. Another thing is what's going on with this total prison system now, where the amount of money that they're making by having these people in prison, phone calls, for instance, the most expensive phone calls they make now, these prisoners miles away in other counties, upstate and so forth, calling home. It costs the family so much just to talk to them. And if somebody's there, they don't want to not take the calls because you don't know what's going on. So they're making lots of money. Now when we know communications, it's getting cheaper and cheaper. They should be able to make calls from upstate to New York City for $1. Right. But they're not. They're paid lots of dollars for it. So that's like one issue where you have so many families that do have people in prison. If you could just take that one issue, like to the state legislature, and say, hey, you have things like watch lines going into New York City, you should have something like that on. These people should not have to pay the operator-assisted calls like $5 for something that should cost you 75 cents. Right. I mean, that's an issue that people could relate to realistically. And then how does the minister say he can't support that? Here's a mother got 2, 3 children in prison, and he can't support something like that. Well, it seems to me he can pick a lot of things like that.
Yeah, but still. But even there, you know, you're simply reacting to a discrete example of oppression. That has very little to do with strategizing for the liberation of the people. That again is a question of survival. That is a survivalist tactic. That's not a liberation tactic. See, the difference would be if, you know, you attack the prison and let all the prisoners out. That's liberation. See what I'm saying? See, we're talking about two different orders of magnitude here. A liberation strategy. Now, I'm perfectly prepared, Geneva, to discuss survivalist tactics with you. But I thought I was here to talk about black liberation. And I'm not, let me tell you something. How did Fidel Castro get the people of Cuba involved in their own liberation? He took 13 men into the mountains. It doesn't take all the masses to effect a revolution. The conditions will create the revolution. Yeah, we can talk all we want to, but you've got to have somebody in place at the time the conditions become so unbearable that they've got some direction. And I would think that that is the role of organizations like UAM. And when I say like UAM, I don't know too many others like UAM. I'll be frank with you.
Atlanta, we had these very rich people in the suburb and the people in the city. And I think this is going to be happening all over. And it seems like it's a deliberate screening or separation of our group. You know, they're screening off the most intellectual, the most active people, and, you know, offering them the goodies of life, which is a very small percentage, you know, and they're leaving the masses behind, and the schools and all the other things are not conducive to encouraging development. So how do you get around a situation like that? It's an organized situation that you really don't seem to have much control over.
Yeah, well, this did not happen accidentally. You know, back in the 1970s, during the administration of Jimmy Carter, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote his famous NSC-46 memorandum, in which he set forth the paradigm for separating the black bourgeoisie from the black masses, and also from separating the militant blacks in America from the revolutionary blacks in Africa, or the progressive blacks in Africa. That was a deliberate government policy, and it was effectuated through the use of the affirmative action programs. A whole new class of Negroes came about as a result of affirmative action. Now that process of containment has worked itself out, they're now dismantling the program because it was so successful. Many black business people, black professionals, black MBAs, black students were put into the middle class as a result of affirmative action. They are now in place. Many of them have begun to lose their jobs, obviously, but it created a division in the physical environment as well as in the mindset of the black bourgeoisie and the black poor. So now, after almost, well, I'd say around 25 years, the black middle class now does not view its objectives, its goals, its values as the same as those of the black masses. That was a deliberate government policy. And it was just an extension of the Willie Lynch theory. You know, you create divisions among people. See, when I was growing up in Lexington, Kentucky, on my block there was my father, who was a black minister. There was 2 doors down, there was a black doctor. Next door to the doctor, there was a cook. A little farther down the street was a bus driver. Everybody kind of lived together. So the children grew up, the bus driver's children grew up playing with the doctor's kids. And the kids of the bus driver went off and they became doctors. They had role models, and they all viewed themselves as a part of the black community. Now you don't have a black community. There's no such thing as a black community anymore. They're just blacks who live in certain sections of town. And the black poor have seen what is happening, and they don't have any regard for the black bourgeoisie. It's impossible now for the black masses to identify in any way with the black bourgeoisie. They can identify with Puff Daddy and the Snoop Doggy Dogg, you know, and Dennis Rodman. They can identify with these fellas. And that's the problem. They have destroyed the black community. Totally destroyed it. And they're to say, you know, let's move up and do this, that, and the other. There are too many persons who get national exposure who were formerly from the masses. See, they have corrupted the self-perception of the masses. Now these kids feel that the only way they can get recognition is go out and shoot somebody or become a rap star or a basketball player or a football player or whatever. And they're not even thinking about the race. See, because Jesse and them are out there, they don't pay any attention to Jesse. They know that Jesse's a fraud. They know that. They know that Kwesi is a fraud. Here he is advertising Budweiser beer to young black children. We got no business having our leaders advertising Budweiser. That's disgusting. So that's where we are. That's why I'm saying I don't think that there's any possibility now. The time is too late. It's too late to save everybody. But there's always the remnant. And right now, frankly, I am talking to the remnant. And I'm saying that we do the best we can with what we have. Tell the truth to everybody. Give everybody a chance to operate on the basis of the truth. And if they prefer to perish, then that's just the way it is. Now, you can't save the whole race. But at least we ought to save those who have the consciousness of race, to at least enough consciousness of race to try to help save themselves.
I would like to thank you very much for your presentation. I mean, many of the things you said, I've been feeling that way for a very long time and haven't had the ability to articulate it the way you can articulate it. I would also like to thank UAM for existing and having be there, because I myself am a black man that came from parents who weren't part of the bourgeois, but they wanted that for me. And because I was exposed to things to feel, as your presentation, I have grown up in anger all my life. And there are times when things happen in the community where I feel that I think this is just too little people to be here. When I come to UAM meetings on Wednesdays, I really think that it's just too little people to be there for what is happening.
Well, let me just say that there's a time and a place for everything, and this is neither the time nor the place for me to give you any further information. I'm offering suggestions. Now, it is up to those of us who have an understanding of the times and who are not afraid to die, to do what has to be done when injustice is visited upon our people. And that's the most that I can say right now. Now, there are ways of doing things And one of the ways you don't do things is to sit down in public and lay out, you know, a strategy. That is not the way it's done. But I can fully empathize with your frustration. I have often felt the same way myself.
They will do whatever you suggested they do. Just talk to them. Them young brothers out there drinking them 40s or whatever. I'm not trying to indicate anything. All I'm saying is they out there, and all you have to do is say the right thing to them, and they will be in your corner. Yes, I'm telling you.
I got some already, don't worry.
I
got some already. I just want more.
But I'm saying, you know the answer.
All right.
You know your own answer.
All right.
Let me tell you how the Algerian War ended. In France during the 50s, I was a student in France during the 50s. And the Algerian War was at its height. And in fact, the war ended the year that I left France in 1958. And the thing that brought that war to a conclusion was that for an entire year, somewhere in France, every day, a French policeman lost his life. Every day. For 365 days. Like clockwork. And that's how the Algerian War ended. Now, let me just say this. In terms of lesser drastic measures for dealing with a racist society such as we're confronted with. A real leader, even assuming that he adopts the theory of survival as an interim strategy or as a tactic, what would a real leader in contemporary America do today? All right, let's assume that we have an unprecedented wave of police brutality in the city of New York. Or let's say it's in, let's use a simpler example. In the city of Atlanta. As you know, Coca-Cola is probably the largest organization, corporation in the city of Atlanta. Nothing moves in Atlanta, Georgia, unless Coke says it moves. All right. Now you've got black children, black women being killed on a daily basis, just as they were during the time of the hysteria around the Wayne Williams case. Now let's make it even simpler. Let's say that the black community is concerned about the use of the Confederate flag as the state flag of Georgia. Let's do a little simple case. Now, how do you get rid of the flag? You got SCLC there, right? Martin Luther King III is the head of SCLC. You want to get rid of the flag? You call a nationwide boycott of Coca-Cola. And no black people buy Coca-Cola for the next 5 years. That's the nature of the boycott. You know, no negotiations. You understand? Either the flag comes down within the next 48 hours, or for 5 years, no black people drink Coca-Cola. Now, if Martin Luther King III went on national television and announced that boycott, don't you think their Confederate flag would come down? We have power that we don't even use. Texaco. Jesse made his deal with Texaco. Texaco should have been declared off limits to black people forever. Forever. You don't make a deal behind somebody calling you all kinds of niggers and everything in their private meetings, and you're going to make a deal to take a little money? That's why they have no respect. We could get a lot more respect if we simply used our economic power. And who have we trusted to guide us in the use of that economic power? A bunch of slaves. who will accept a few dollars and sell the whole race down the river. That's our problem. That's why I say there's an intellectual vacuum there among the black leadership. They don't even understand the nature of power. There's enough black money circulating in this economy to bring any industry to its knees as we speak. That's assuming you want to stay here and survive. That is a real survival strategy. But this stuff they're doing with these little marches and things, I mean, that's nothing. Nothing. That's slavery. You don't march and beg some cracker to get off your back. You call your people together, you go on national television and say we're not going to buy Cadillacs for the next 5 years. No more Cadillacs, that's it. Don't you think some changes would be made in America?
Mentioned that we suffer from an impoverished consciousness. So what can we do as Africans to develop a collective African consciousness? Because I feel that is needed to help propel us to liberation. Because I think you mentioned it before, but I still don't think it really hit home the difference between survival and liberation. But I think if we somehow develop a global African consciousness, we can move further toward liberation of our people rather than just self-survival. How can we do that?
Well, you know, I wish I had the answer to that question. There are no easy answers to developing an African consciousness. The first requirement for an African consciousness is that the people of Africa themselves have an African consciousness. And I would suggest to you that their consciousness of Africa is less than ours. We are the vanguard, the few of us in America who understand what time of day it is. We are the leaders. The African leadership is mostly pro-European. They have a colonial mentality, and we cannot look to them for leadership. The leadership must come from this side of the water. And it comes from the West Indies, and it comes from the United States of America. That's where it comes from. And it must never think that you're going to be able to come up with a program that will somehow raise the consciousness of all the people of African descent in the world. That's not going to happen unless they come after all of us simultaneously. Then the consciousness will be developed. But that might be too late. So that's why I'm saying we start with the remnant, just like Fidel started with a remnant of 13 good men as he marched into the hills. And I was in Yale Law School in the lounge the day he marched into Havana, and the white boys were scared to death. Yeah. I'll never forget that. Came in on a tank.
Get information on applying for dual citizenship ID card.
I'll give you the address of an organization in Atlanta either later this afternoon or tomorrow. But remind me to do it. Yeah, they have all the information on how you become a citizen of an African country. Yeah. It's always good to have an extra passport. Young lady.
What does that do to our thinking?
I didn't hear you. Mm-hmm. Oh, I don't deal with that. I'll be frank with you. I just, I don't care what they call me. I'm a Negro, black. I am not an African American. You understand? I'm not, there's nothing about me that's an American. So now, you understand? I don't like that term. And I resent the fact that Jesse Jackson can go to Africa and come back telling us who we are. I don't like that. Now, I'm not an American. I don't have any allegiance to this country. And I don't salute the flag. I don't stand up when they play the national anthem. Ever. People look at me like I'm crazy when I go to basketball games and whatnot. I refuse to do it. I will not legitimize what they've done to black people in this country. My whole life is based on the fact that I am an alien in this land. I live here because I have to. My family's here, but I am prepared to leave at the drop of a hat.
I've heard on television recently and on radio talk shows, there's a particular black woman who calls the talk shows, and I've met her actually, and she always speaks of Black Africa. And I always wonder why she would have to use black as an adjective to describe Africa. To me, Africans are black people. I don't think we have to describe, because then it seems that we're giving away Africa to other people who have raped it in order to take the possessions of Africa. So why should we even use the term to identify ourselves as black Africans, or Africans in Africa as black Africans or black Africa? I don't.
Yeah, well, some people use the term black Africa to refer to sub-Saharan Africa because the Arabs, they inhabit most of North Africa. That's why she was probably using it. Yeah. And a lot of the Arabs really don't want to be associated with black people. Even those with black skins have a problem. Well, does that conclude this aspect of it? Have we run out of time, or we got more time before we have a break? Go just a step further.